Okay, I'm talking about Laura Mulvey, and I'm talking about visual pleasure and narrative cinema, which is a really famous, one of the most famous pieces of film criticism, film theory around. And she uses Lacanian psychoanalysis to talk about the way in which movies tend to work. She's talking primarily about classic Hollywood movies, which is to say in the classical Hollywood style. But a lot of what she says is relevant today about box office pictures. And what you'll notice when I'm talking is that the film we looked at is sometimes an example of what she means and sometimes a counterexample of what she means. I'm referring to Kaplan's Little Red Riding Hood. She starts off by talking about Lacanian psychoanalysis as having a political dimension, and she's specifically talking about the way in which women work in Lacanian psychoanalysis. So especially as castrated. Women are castrated and thus lack a phallus, and yet that lack is required in order to structure the symbolic order. The symbolic order works only because the phallus is, capital P phallus operates as some transcendental signified, and that is only meaningful if it's contrasted in some sort of binary with castration. Okay, so she's talking about how the symbolic order and patriarchy and all of the things that go along with that depend actually upon woman is castrated. And she goes on, I'm sort of going to run through here before I bring out my chalkboard with my visual aid. Some of the quotations, especially under number 2, which is on page 669. She says in section A, the cinema offers a number of possible pleasures. One is scopophilia, the pleasure in looking. And she means here literally a pleasure in looking, but looking like a voyeur, looking like watching, looking like gazing upon. And scopophilia is going to dominate the way she sets up different kinds of watching or different kinds of narratives, really. I'm going to talk about the different kinds of narratives in just a second. First, I want to talk about one other major point of hers, which is that at the very end, she says this is the very end. This complex interaction of looks is specific to film, which is to say she's doing a Lacanian analysis, but she's making it political and specific to film. She's not doing the sort of larger thing that Lacan is doing, but she's doing it in the way that we might describe as something that one applies to literature or film in this case. The first blow against the monolithic accumulation of traditional film conventions is to free the look of the camera into its materiality in time and space, which means that she's looking at the form of film, the way it's actually made, the materiality of it, like it's actually film. Okay, I'm skipping ahead. There is no doubt that this destroys the satisfaction, pleasure, and privilege of the invisible guest and highlights the way film has depended on voyeuristic, active, passive mechanisms. She wants us to acknowledge that we're not just watching a film, but that we're doing it in some scopophilic way. We're not just looking at a piece of film, we're actively watching in a scopophilic way. Women whose image has continually been stolen and used for this end cannot view the decline of the traditional film form with anything much more than sentimental regret. Oh, what she's saying is that the traditional film form, by which she means classic Hollywood cinema, but which might apply to a lot of cinema today, films today, is hard for women to mourn because it depends specifically on seeing women as castrated. This is not surprising to us because we've looked at Lacan. She does allow politically for the possibility of other kinds of cinema. And we might want to talk in class about how Kaplan is or isn't one of those kinds. When she talks about scopophilia, she talks about the male gaze. And the male gaze is an important phrase that always takes you back to Mulvey. And it means that when we gaze, when scopophilia operates, we're always watching as men. So it doesn't matter whether you are a clitoris person or a penis person or a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, you're always watching as a male man and looking at women as if you desired women. That's just true, independent of who you are and what you like. And what she is sort of assuming, not assuming, but showing us is that the film requires us to take that position. There are two ways in which a film might require us to take that position. And I'm going to show them to you in what I think is a much simpler way than the way she lays it out. I'm not saying anything differently than what she says, but I'm organizing it differently in a way that might help while you're reading it, you to keep track of the different kinds, the two different kinds of scopophilia. So here's my chalkboard. Okay. Oh no. This isn't supposed to be fuzzy. The first kind is voyeurism, and the second kind is narcissism. Voyeurism configures woman as to be looked at-ness. So you can't tell because it's fuzzy, but this says looked at-ness, and there are hyphens between those words, and that's a quotation. Woman is to be looked at-ness. Women are meant to be looked at, but that is also all they are. Okay. Women are castrated, and a film must punish or somehow reclaim a woman, a castrated person. So you punish the castrated person, or you somehow reclaim her by the end of the film. And in classic Hollywood films, and maybe some films, maybe most films today, this makes the film tragic or comic or inscribes the virgin whore dichotomy or something like that. But you punish or reclaim the woman who's just on film waiting to be looked at, being looked at. This requires a narrative. To punish the woman or to reclaim her requires that there be a story. You can't punish someone without telling us what she needs to be punished for. So there are a lot of different examples of this, but if you take any film that ends with the woman being found out and left on her own, or a woman being forgiven, for example, for some probably infidelity or whatever women do to men, you need to have the story of that happening in order for the punishment to occur. And Mulvey links voyeurism then with sadism, that this type of scopophilia is sadistic. So voyeurism and sadism go together. The other kind of scopophilia is narcissism, which focuses on man as bearer of the look. That just means that the man looks at the woman. And this is the man like us sitting in the theater. It's the man in the film who's watching the woman. And it actually works perfectly in sync. Man is bearer of the look and woman is to be looked at-ness. But the emphasis in narcissism is on the man as bearer of the look, meaning the one who looks. And in this configuration, we identify, we're not just watching the woman, we're identifying with the man in the film. And the man in the film is watching the woman. And this kind of film responds to the fear of castration by disavowing it. We disavow the fear of castration, not by punishing the woman for being castrated, because that's not a disavowal, but by fetishizing the woman. We fetishize different parts of her body, and thus we aren't focusing on her as a castrated subject, we're focusing on parts of her or aspects of her body that could be fetishized just in the traditional way where you have a foot fetish or a hair fetish or whatever else all the fetishes are, hand fetish. Or it could just be that you fetishize her as a sexual object. But either way, you are saying that castration isn't scary because it's not operative here. Both of these ways of scopophilia are responses to woman as castrated and ways of watching a film that will allow you, the male viewer, to respond somehow to your fear of castration that arises whenever you see a woman on the screen. Sorry about the pause, Jameson had a need. If it helps you while you're reading, I've labeled voyeur as the first way, A, and narcissism as the second way, B, and I just made that up. Mulvey doesn't call them by those letters or even talk about them as sort of going along with each other in the ways that I've linked them up. If it helps you, you might write A and B in the margins where she seems to be talking about one or the other. I think that's helpful since her essay isn't structured the way I would normally structure my own essays, which makes it a little harder to read. I love Laura Mulvey. I hope you do too. Again, it's a really good example of how Lacanian analysis gets applied to actual texts. Okay, I'll see you Friday.